My name is Paula Clancy. I'm TASC's director, and this event is hosted by TASC. So I'm really very happy to welcome everybody here this evening and to see such a great turnout on a July summer evening. I think it says a lot about the expectation of a good evening, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. As hopefully you may know, TASC is an independent think tank, and we have a very extensive programme of evidence-based research and policy, all of it aimed at promoting a more equal society. In particular, we work on policy solutions which will lead to greater economic equality, and therefore tonight's event is particularly relevant to our work and where we come from. All the available evidence tells us that high quality public services available equally to all are actually a hugely important means of creating greater equality. Now, obviously that takes money, and we say a lot about the need to invest heavily in high quality public services financially, but money isn't enough. The way the public service works is critical. The way it's structured, its systems, its practices, and of course its culture all makes the difference. It makes the difference in whether investment actually delivers high quality public services. And of course this is the terrain of the Ombudsman's Office and why tonight's event is so relevant. Emily O'Reilly has been Ireland's Ombudsman and Information Commissioner now for 7 years, and during that time, I suppose while very carefully guarding the neutrality of her position as Ombudsman, she has been an extraordinarily strong advocate of the kind of public services which are consistent with a more equal society. In her various public utterances, she frequently contextualises very specific public service issues with which her office has to deal and places them within the wider social and economic context. And I think, therefore, what she has to say tonight will be of great importance and of great interest to us. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the discussion between herself and Mark, and then with yourselves. And we're delighted as well, of course, that Mark Mortel has agreed to steer this second encounter. Those of you who were present at the first encounter back in the spring with Fintan O'Toole will know what a fantastic job he did. And perhaps that's in fact also why many of you may be back tonight. Of course, Mark is very well known as the presenter of News Talk's Down to Business programme. He's been has a very strong business background as well. He's been with the PR and communications consultancy Fleischmann Hillard since 2002, and before that he worked with Aer Lingus, and he's also a former chairman of Bord Fáilte, the Irish Tourist Board. And he's also been a politician. He served as a member of both Bray UDC and Wicklow County Council in the 1980s. So this breadth, as well as depth of experience of the business, media and political worlds, makes him really the ideal person to direct the TASC Encounter series. And I'm really delighted to welcome him and to wish him well again in his task tonight. So I think we'll get straight down to the encounter. Mark.
Most of you will know Emily because she's been, I suppose, an item on our agenda for many, many years. From Tullamore in County Offaly, a county, of course, that also heralds the Taoiseach. Married with 5 children, but obviously leads a very, very busy life outside of her private life. We were talking outside about the challenges many, many years ago when she took on a radio career. I was telling her that I'm doing the early morning stuff at the moment, so I've been going since 4 o'clock this morning, and feeling a little bit the worst, but the adrenaline will get going in a second. Emily's a graduate of both UCD and Trinity College, has been an accomplished journalist and commentator for many, many years with the Irish Press and with the Sunday's Tribune, Times and Business Post over time. She was also editor of McGill, and I think if I read the data correctly, left because a sister magazine in McGill at the time got into a bit of trouble in what I might call a human rights issue, which we'll come back to later on in the conversation. She also spent a memorable time as a broadcaster, and I recall when what was then Radio Ireland, now Today FM, started. Emily did the early morning breakfast programme, you might remember, with Gavin Duffy. How long did that go on for?
Felt like years. It was only about a year.
About a year, I'd say, yes. And then they decided to revamp Radio Ireland into a music station, which of course is much easier to do and much cheaper, but at the same time, very, very successful, and now of course Today FM. Emily, of course, excelled as a journalist. She was Woman Journalist of the Year in 1986 and Journalist of the Year in 1994. Contributed to magazines and publications around the world, including The Spectator, the Boston Globe, among others, and was the recipient of the Nyman Fellowship in Journalism from Harvard University, and was awarded a Doctor of Laws from the National University of Ireland for your contribution not only to public services but also to human rights. And you can see the theme here. Emily became Ombudsman in 2003. And last month, as I said, was appointed to a second-year term by the President. She sits on the Standards of Public Office Commission. She sits on the Referendum Commission. She sits on the Constituency Commission and the Commission for Public Service Appointments. And last year also became a Commissioner for Environmental Information. Goodness me, it's an awful lot of commissions. It's an awful lot of supervision. It's an awful lot of keeping an eye on what's going on. But I think the best description of what Emily O'Reilly does is the description she gave herself, which is she's a watchdog for the people. And that, I think, really does capture what this is all about. But maybe to begin, Emily, I talked about your journalism, and you were a hungry journalist when you were there, and never afraid to ask the hard questions. Did you enjoy it?
I loved it, yeah. I was spent 20 years as a journalist and all, and I was a political correspondent from 1989 up until the time that I became Ombudsman in 2003. I was political correspondent first for the Irish Press, and then moved on to the Sunday Times and McGill and various things, but I absolutely loved it. I mean, from the time I was a child, I was very curious about things. I was also very interested in politics. My late dad was very interested in politics, and I remember even as an 8-year-old child getting interested in US elections and results of all sorts of elections and so on. So I was very curious about the world, and I suppose journalism was I think when I left school I either wanted to be a scientist or a journalist, you know. I was just curious about stuff.
So you took
I took the easy route.
Most difficult of the two routes, yeah.
I took the easy route. No, I loved it. It was a hugely privileged to be I mean, it's a cliche to say you're part of history, but you are. You know, you're watching things unfold. You have a ringside seat, and there was something different every day. It was never ever boring.
And you were there, of course, during a really interesting time. I mean, in terms of being a political journalist, you couldn't have asked for more excitement.
No, well, it was the last few years of Charles J. Haughey's time as
leader of Fianna Fáil.
Yeah, so there were the various heaves, and then the finality, I think, in 1992, when after revelations in relation to phone tapping, then he was effectively forced to resign by the PDs. So that was a very exciting period, and then it was followed by the Rainbow Coalition, which I think an awful lot of political correspondents would probably agree with me when it was actually one of the most boring periods in terms of you know, intrigue and conspiracies and all of that, you know. It was a very calm period, and they had a particular attitude to the media, which was quite closed actually, and quite controlled. And then that finished, and then
where did you think that control and closed was coming from? I mean, there was a very much a, if we recall, a triumvirate running that government. There was the Taoiseach, John Bruton, and then you had Francis de Rossa and Dick Spring.
Yeah, well, we had just come from a period in which I think Albert Reynolds had been. Yeah, Albert Reynolds, of course, came in after
the 2 year, and then there was the.
And I remember at the beginning,
Albert
Reynolds instituted this thing where he said he was going to have a meeting with the political correspondents every week, and Sean Dignan, or Diggy, was the government press secretary. And I remember Diggy saying to us that when he told his colleagues, who would have been kind of people like Alistair Campbell at the time, they almost keeled over at the idea that the Taoiseach was going to do this. So anyway, it started off, and there weren't as many political correspondents then as there are now, obviously with the expansion of the media. So there was myself, I think Una Claffey, Geraldine Kennedy, Donald Kelly, Chris Glennon, you know, a particular grouping. But then the X case happened quite early on. If you recall, the then Attorney General Harry Whelan made a decision to prosecute, not to allow this young girl who had been raped and had become pregnant to go to the UK for an abortion. So this issue blew up almost as soon as Albert became Taoiseach.
Yeah.
So this, obviously, we were questioning him very closely on this, and I think it was the sort of issue that he was very uncomfortable with. I think a lot of people are. I think particularly perhaps men are. I think older men of an older generation was particular, and I think he found that extremely difficult. And so these Paul Carr meetings carried on for a while, and then they kind of petered out. There was too much that was coming out. You know?
There was almost an overcommitment to communicate.
Yeah, and I think possibly when the Rainbow Coalition came in, I don't think they may have seen what had happened, and maybe there was a view that they might be a little less, you know, generous with their
time and their view of the world. However, it was quite a successful government.
Yes, I'm just remembering my
a little bit more conviction there.
Say
that
that?
just,
Well, I think most people would have seen that it was effective, and I suppose a lot of the decisions that were taken then would have cued the economic boom that was there. It certainly worked well. I suppose looking back, what is widely held to have been the kind of the decision that possibly ensured that they didn't retain power was, I think, at the time, John Bruton decided to go early for an election, and I think there was some dissent, maybe if they'd gone late or whatever. But in any event, Fianna Fáil came back into power, and that was
with the PDs.
With the PDs, yeah.
And that created the beginning of what was, and what is still, I suppose, a government we've all come to know and love and then hate. Would that be a reasonable way of describing it?
No comment.
Oh, how times have changed, Emily O'Reilly, if I may say.
Well,
what in the name of goodness then drove you to move from that world of observing, commenting, being part of that rough and tumble to being persuaded by, I gather, Charlie McCreevy to take on this challenge?
Yeah, he approached me and he said that Kevin Murphy was thinking of retiring. Charlie McCreevy was Minister for Finance at the time, and Finance is the parent department of the Ombudsman, the Information Commissioner, and he asked me would I consider becoming Ombudsman. And at the time, I mean, did take me a while to make up my mind, because I absolutely loved journalism, and I'd written some books, and I was a lot of young children as well at the time, and I just didn't see myself moving out of that. But I suppose it was great privilege to be asked, a job that was an institution that had been set up at that stage for about 20 years, was very highly regarded. You had the Information Commissioner bit onto it as well, Standards and Public Office Commission. So in that sense, I was still going to be in the same space and actually getting kind of deeper into it, sort of seeing a little bit more from the inside. But also in terms of the space I was inhabiting, I wasn't poacher turned gamekeeper. I was still in that, not that you're that neutral as a journalist, but that neutral space between the government and the people. Yeah.
Now, I always think the Ombudsman's office, for me, and maybe it's my age, was defined by another former journalist, Michael Mills, also Irish Press, and he created, I think, the tone, and I want to talk to that because you made a reference to that in a speech later on, but the tone that Michael Mills set was a thing about fairness and reasonableness and good common sense, I always thought, and we might come back to that. But when McCreevy asked you to do it, did he charm you into it? Because he's capable of being very persuasive.
Well, look, it was a great job, I mean, it wasn't as if I was being offered something that was not attractive. I suppose one of the things, I suppose I'd always enjoyed the freedom as a journalist to say what I wanted to say, and the freedom to do that. And I knew that was going to be a little more constricted. And also, I think as well, when you get into an office like mine, and you said you've got this for 6 years, it's almost like your life is being parcelled out a bit in chunks, and that was kind of a tricky concept to get around. But no, he didn't charm me into it. But when I discussed it with my husband and thought it through, I went for it. Yeah.
A more stable life.
Yeah, I mean, but I always I didn't ever wanted a stable life particularly. I mean, I enjoyed the kind of the anarchy of journalism, and never having to clock in or out, which, not that I clock in or out now necessarily, but it is more structured in that sense. I mean, I absolutely adored that. And I mean, I have 5 children at the time when I became Ombudsman. The youngest was 3 and the eldest was was 13, and journalism had allowed me to, you know, accommodate that, if you like, because the last employer I had was the Sunday Times, and they had very kindly set me up with their particular system in my home. So I had an office at home, I had an office there, so I could work that way. But yeah, so I did enjoy the slight anarchy of journalism appealed to my personality, I suppose.
You're inner anarchist.
Well, whatever, you know.
So taking this on and moving into the public service, moving into that structured environment, becoming a watchdog that's of the system but in the system, real big change.
Well, huge, because going from the private sector to the public sector was huge. But going from, you know, the journalism, which is so immediate and, you know, so fast-paced, to go into the public service was, you know, huge. And of course, you know, nobody, I used to say, you know, well, maybe it's different now, but nobody, child in school or in college, wakes up and thinks, God, I'd love to be an ombudsman. You know, it's not that. It's not that sort of role, and you know, you go in and you're kind of torn, because you can think, well, Jesus, I have to pretend I know what I'm doing, and on the other hand, God, I don't know what I'm doing, and you know, the officials in the office are, of course, too polite to sort of, you know, suggest to you that you know nothing, and so they're, you know, they're very, you know, courteous and polite and whatever. And my predecessor, Kevin Murphy, who has been fantastic and always available to me, almost in a mentor capacity, of course, he's not going to tell me how to do anything either. So, you know, the door is open, you sit down, here's a file, and that's it, get on with it, you know.
And how did you feel that group of people reacted to you? You were...
Within the public service.
Yeah, or the group even in the Ombudsman's office, because you were... You know, you were a very different type of
well, yes,
personality.
I was a woman. I was a journalist. I mean, Michael Mills had been a journalist, but he was also an older man.
Yes.
You know, I was 45 when I got the job, and both Michael and Kevin, I think, were in their mid to late 50s. You know, so there was a kind of a generational thing. And Kevin had also been Secretary General of the Department of the Public Service before it went back into finance. So he was a mandarin. I mean, he knew his stuff. And of course, people in the office would have kind of, you know, because a lot of them have civil service backgrounds, would very much looked up to him. And here was this kind of younger woman who was a journalist, a high profile. You know, I remember saying to people in the office, you know, the good thing about me getting this job is that I'll get profile for the office, because there was a curiosity about it. And I said the bad thing about it is that I'll get profile for the office, you know.
Yeah, because I mean, I think the cynics at the time might have said the government at the time and McCreevy were using this to their own political advantage, that they were being seen to be
well, I think at the time there was one political advantage that was commented at the time, which was that the FOI Act had just been sort of axed and fees had been brought in, and you know, I think the commentary around my appointment was because I was seen as quite, you know, independent and reasonably outspoken, that this was almost like a sop to the lobby that would say, you know, what was that? But, you know, I wasn't, you know, that was the commentary at the time. I mean, one of the things that did please me, that, I was effectively a government appointee, as my predecessors had been, but I was supported by everybody in the Dáil, by all parties in the Dáil, and that to me was a huge support when I went in, because even though, you know, I might have given at various times said not very nice things about them, I think there was an appreciation that I wasn't going to be partisan, that I was independent, and that nobody, you know, there was no issue there, you know.
Have your perspectives changed as a result of this experience for 6 years, comparing it with the 20 years as a political journalist?
Not hugely. I mean, I think the best, I say to people, if I had been interviewed, if there had been, I mean, a lot of people think that these jobs, and perhaps they're right, there should be a open competition, and I think it'll move towards that in the future. But I think had I gone in open competition, I don't think I would have got the job necessarily, because I'm sure, because people think ombudsman, public administration, regulations, and you know, I would not have had any sort of in-depth knowledge about that. But my experience of being an ombudsman and what I think I can bring to it is, you know, I always feel that the one thing an ombudsman should have over their desk laminated are the words, "Ah, for God's sake." you know, like, for God's sake. And it's don't look at the laws, the regulation, well, look at them eventually, you know, if you have to. But it's this sense of you look at something and you feel instinctively that's wrong, that's stupid, that's, you know, that is just not right. But I remember it's very different in other countries. For example, in the Scandinavian countries, you have to be a lawyer, you have to be a judge, you have to have a very high level of legal qualifications to become an ombudsman because of the nature of their system. So I remember one of the first phone calls I got after I became ombudsman was from the Norwegian ombudsman, Arne Fleiflet, who's become quite a good friend. And almost the first question out of him was, well, what are your legal qualifications? Yes. And I said, well, I don't have any, you know. So, but we you know, we manage. And sometimes I think actually it's better not to have legal qualifications, because if you do, I think there may be a tendency to get too hung up on, you know, the innards of a regulation or a law and whatever, and you lose sight of the picture. Because, I mean, there would be no, if it was just about the law and just about regulations, you wouldn't need an ombudsman. You'd have the courts to do all that sort of stuff,
yes.
You know.
And of course, before the ombudsman, that was the only
That was the only avenue, you know. So when people were being given the runaround by a public body, and the public body hadn't done anything illegal, but it was just wrong, it was unfair, it was unjust, it was whatever, there was nobody that they could go to. And that is the space that, you know, the classic ombudsman fills.
So if you take the common sense, for God's sake, sort of point of view, if you take your first, 7 years now, what is the, what sticks out for you as the most extraordinarily ridiculous things that have gone on, that are tolerated and that people are made to put up with?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there can be huge delays in the system, and there can be huge delays in my office as well. You know, my office is not perfect by any means. It's a very hard question, because I think if I look at it and stand back and look at it, it is the way in which people are not treated as individuals, you know. That very often when people have a problem, they simply want somebody to engage with them. And recently I had a personal issue with a public body, not a body that comes under my remit. And I was almost tearing my hair out trying to get somebody to listen to me, to talk to me, to tell me what my options are and whatever. Eventually, after I almost took an axe into the inside of this building, somebody sat down and talked with me. And I mean, I am the ombudsman, they knew that. I wasn't pulling rank or anything like that, and believe me, they were not treating me.
Okay, so you weren't getting any special treatment here?
No, I was not getting any special treatment.
Or were they being specially difficult?
Well, perhaps, no, I don't think so. But I felt like one of my complainants.
Right.
And I thanked the individual who eventually sat down with me, and I said, you know, it's so nice to talk to a human being.
Right.
You know, and I think even if people don't get a good result necessarily, it is that. I think it's also it's people's, and particularly certain public servants' fear of using their discretion. They want things written down. They want things black and white. If something is outside the norm, it's a bit scary.
And is that because there is now a very evident and real protect your backside attitude, mentality, fear of litigation, terror of getting in trouble?
Well, it's that. It's kind of laziness as well. It's also, I think, perhaps there's still a slightly paternalistic, hierarchical structure within the public service and the civil service. So if you're in a certain rank, you're told you do this and you don't do that. And sometimes people feel, well, God, if I, you know, go outside of this little box, I'll get into trouble. So I'll stay here and.
Well, seeing as you've opened that door for me now, I'll go down it, because you didn't answer that last question very, very spectacularly well, if I may say. Can I ask you about public sector reform? Because there is no doubt, if we live in a public sector that's utterly bureaucratic and organised in a hierarchical way to do things in a particular way through a system that's designed and organised to exist for whatever purpose it's set up. And that's the driving force, rather than necessarily service or outcomes or treating people as human beings, as you were just saying. Well, there must be a case.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, you kind of learn particular language when you go into the public service, and you try and people come out with these words and you try and pretend you actually do know what they mean. But one of the things I learned early on was the difference between outputs and outcomes.
Yeah.
People would be doing strategic plans and stuff, and they'd be talking about outputs and outcomes. So I said, what's the difference between an output and an outcome? So if you take it in the prison sense, an output is that we build 500 new prison spaces. An outcome is that there are fewer people going back to prison, or we lower the recidivism rate. That's an outcome. An output is that we get 500 extra nurses. An outcome is that we lower the rates of cancer.
Okay.
And I think if you're talking about public service reform, it has to be on the outcome bit and not the output.
Not the output. But
bit.
that probably means designing the management systems quite differently.
Yeah, I mean, they talk about, this was another concept that I had difficulty getting my head around, which was designing public services around the individual, following the individual, following the person and so on. But I think, people forget sometimes that we're a tiny country, and we set up these big complex systems, and we looked at the system instead of the instead of the individual. And I was just looking, the Taoiseach's department runs these Public Service Excellence Awards.
Yeah.
And if you look at them and the ones that win, they're actually all around, they're not around systems, they're actually around real problems of real people and real innovative solutions to solve them. So there was this particular one around the very young male prison population in a particular area in the North Inner City. And I just glanced at this briefly, I don't know what was done. But the outcome was the recidivism rate in that area was reduced by 65%,
Wow.
which was
Quite
extraordinary.
impressive, yeah.
Quite extraordinary. So this was taking it out of the big global system and a group of bright people getting together with real people in their sites and creating something around them that had an outcome.
Well, you've got a unique vantage point to maybe see those kind of opportunities, to see where it works, because I'm sure there are wonderful things going on
Yeah.
a lot of the time. And then we often see, and journalists and your former colleagues in the Fourth Estate would have been, exposing things that don't work. Are there any things that you'd say, goodness, if this happened more often from your time as Ombudsman, it would actually transform a lot of people's lives? Anything that sort of comes up?
Well, you see, by definition, we just get the
bad things.
The bad things, the complaints, I suppose one of the things that, and I suppose this is, it's almost, when I say it, it's still the health system, it's still the HSE. I don't know anybody who fully understands it. I mean, I listen to lots of debates around it, I read quite a lot around it, and I still don't know why it can't work. And I have to say, I do feel sorry for Professor Brendan Trump. Okay, he was in that position. He agreed to take it on. He had a good salary and all of that. And I suspect that a lot of the things that he has put in place, we won't see the outcome of
for some time.
But I think there were so many things to wrestle with that he almost had an impossible job. But I think one of the things I do think we have to have a debate about, and I know I'm getting into slightly political territory here, is the public-private issue.
Yep.
We really do, because as a user of the health system, more and more you're beginning to see the two-tier nature of it. And a few months ago, an elderly relative had a minor accident. So my husband, it was a Sunday evening, all he wanted to do was have a glass of wine, read the papers,
Relax.
whatever. So the objective, he faced probably sitting for several hours in a Beaumont or wherever. So I remembered, I said, I think there's a new private A&E service close to home. Back in an hour,
Relative looked after.
Relative looked after, 80 years, and increasingly.
And you paid your €110 or whatever it was.
Whatever, fine. But you see, when people, and I say this in a very broad and general way, when people like us are looked after, if we have the money to shell out to make sure that we're not inconvenienced, that we get the treatment, whatever, then our voices stop. We stop ringing Joe Duffy and clamouring for that because we're looked after. And so what would concern me, and I know concerns people, is that the public health system then begins to suffer. And recently, I know this is kind of the book du jour, you know, which is the Spirit Level. I'm sure you've read about it, which is a book that was put together by academic, I think they're anthropologists or something, you know. And they've looked at outcomes in effectively the developed Western world, Australia and Canada and so on. And when they looked at outcomes in education, in health, in prison, in crime, in suicide, in virtually every case, it was the societies that were the most equal, in other words, that there was the smallest gap between top income and low income, that had the best outcomes.
So we're back up to Scandinavia or wherever.
We're back up to Scandinavia, but you hear, you know, Scandinavia mentioned all the time, you know. It has become the reference point, you know.
Is our system capable of changing to the extent that it would have to change to become something like a Scandinavian model?
Well, you see, I think it goes back to to culture, you know, and what defines that. And I mean, one of the things that I've done a lot of work on is around nursing homes, okay, and also around. I've done a lot of work with the Hospice Foundation in relation to dying, obviously, death in hospital and so on and so forth. And, you know, when you read the statistics and when you hear the stories about the awful conditions in which people die in hospitals, you know, typically a crowded ward with, you know, football match on and no space and no room to grieve and life going on around it and all of that. And then when you read equally in nursing homes, the way many elderly people die with very little dignity. And then, you know, when you probe a bit and you hear, well, it's the resources and we've no private rooms and we've this and this. But I have absolutely no doubt at all that if we had it as a public value, that nobody, insofar as it is possible, obviously people die suddenly in A&E and all that nobody was going to die when the death was foreseen, then that would happen. It would simply happen. Because we have a public value in this country that everybody gets a primary school education. Everybody. Yep. You know, there are very few instances where a child cannot get into school. And you don't hear, I mean, there may be appalling buildings and no running water and, you know, the loo outside and all that sort of thing. But by and large, children can get access to a national school, a primary school education, because that's a public value. And it happens. It has to happen. Right? So if we don't have public values around, you know, nursing home standards, around, you know, how people die, how children get access to therapies, to dental care, then it won't happen.
But that requires leadership. It requires somebody to make it happen. It requires changing the system. Yeah. And we've heard all about we need leadership. And nobody has ever quite explained to me what that actually looks like, you know. And there has been a lot of commentary around, and I've added to that, around the Parliament not being fit for purpose, to use that other kind of a cliche. But I think we have to look at ourselves as well. And recently I was preparing a talk, and I was looking at newspaper coverage of the boom years and newspaper coverage in particular of Sean Fitzpatrick, the former chairman of Anglo-Irish, as if we need to be told. A lot of newspaper coverage.
A lot of newspaper
so
coverage.
You went through a lot of papers to look at.
Went through, well, I just go into a search engine, I took 2005 to 2007, okay? Boom years. The coverage was virtually universally hagiographic. Yeah. And when you read the headlines now, and they leap off the page, and say Anglo profits soared to 28%, or directors given €9.1 million, and these were largely unquestioned. And there was a particular event in the middle, 2006, that Sean Fitzpatrick went to. He was speaking at it, and it was a property awards dinner. Property Advertising Awards dinner. Okay. And Sean Fitzpatrick was the main speaker, and he spoke about the evils of overregulation, and just land-based. At that time, I don't know, there was some chatter about greater regulation coming in, and there was this wonderful line, and he said, I mean, where is the evidence, he said, that there are companies that are doing the dirty on their customers, that there are boards of directors who are turning a blind eye to bad stuff that's going on? Where is the evidence of that, you know? And the following day, one of the headlines in the paper said, in relation to Sean Fitzpatrick's speech, thoughtful and stimulating. What makes a leader, or something, okay? Now, the following day, he was obviously interviewed, and he repeated the same stuff. And last Sunday on the This Week programme, a clip of that was played with Sean about to be declared a bankrupt, and the country virtually bankrupted because of him and whatever. And we were supposed to think, gosh, the irony of it, and tut-tut about it. Yet just 3 or 4 years ago, the same chatter was presented in...
Okay, now that raises serious questions about the way we report, the way we respond to stimulus, and the role played by, you've been a journalist for 20 years, by the way media deal with things, and the instantaneous response to things rather than...
But you see, there was a particular narrative of ourselves being told.
That's the point, yeah.
And, you know, I hate to say we all, because we all didn't, you know, clearly. And I'm sure there are many people in this room who, at the time, knew there was something very, very wrong about what was happening. But nobody wanted that narrative to be disturbed, you know.
Because we were self-focused and selfish. But you see,
and again, lots of people were profiting from this. I mean, the profits may now all be gone, and we're back to whatever we're back to. But at the time, and it wasn't just, you know, when I was growing up, there were 2 millionaires. You know, there was Michael Smurfit and there was Tony O'Reilly, and that was about it. You know, but at a certain point, in quite, you know, modest estates all around the country, there were lots of millionaires, you know. And I remember a politician telling me a story one time in the middle of all of this when he met a group of taxi drivers, you see, and Charlie McCreevy had done something which they were criticising him for. I can't remember what it was. And they were all given out, and I think there was some speculation that Charlie's job was on the line or something, which it wasn't, but anyway. And anyway, eventually, as the conversation went on, this politician discovered that each of the taxi drivers had little property portfolios. And as the conversation continued, it dawned on all of them that this was courtesy, partly, of Charlie McCreevy. Yes. And so the conversation ended with one of them saying, God, I hope nothing happens to him. You know?
The irony of that.
So, and like, you know, David McWilliams tells us very often that...
and he's doing it on stage now. So.
Yeah, exactly. That, whatever. And interspersed throughout this, you know, I got a sheaf of stuff, you know, that I printed off about, you know, newspaper clippings and that. But there were people. I mean, the Central Bank, you know, in 2006 was warning about whatever, the European Central Bank, might they have been having a word in our ear?
Maybe so.
But nobody wanted to know. And even, you know, certain economists, I remember there was one thing, you know, when they were challenged around, well, you know, what happens if house building slows down or something? Oh, well then, don't worry about it, because the construction industry will then move on to infrastructural projects. Yes. And like, where was the money going to come from? So a lot of people were wrapped up in this fairy tale, and it was unquestioning. Now, when you look at it, I mean, it's extraordinary, but at the time it was, you know.
Let me move on to something, because also in your job is the Information Commissioner, and the Freedom of Information Act, as you mentioned, had just come into force when the office started to get its teeth, maybe. How do you feel that's evolved, and what's your view of the elements of government activity, and let's take NAMA up, given the conversation we've just had here now, falling outside the remit?
Well, I've said on a number of occasions that I think in my view, and you see, I inhabit a different space because I'm not an advocate per se of FOI, but there aren't that many advocates out there, so sometimes I do have a statutory role to encourage public bodies to, you know, give out information. But as you know, it can be tricky. I think there is there is a case to be made for the financial institutions, NAMA and Anti-May and the financial regulator and the central bank, all coming within FOI. Their equivalents, well, I don't think the UK have an equivalent of NAMA yet, but their equivalents in the UK do come under the Freedom of Information Act, and the heavens haven't fallen. There is an issue around commercial sensitivity, but as I've said on numerous occasions, the FOI Act is not there to do harm. And if there are serious commercial sensitivities. But I was listening to...
Do you think it's abused, by the way?
What?
The Freedom of Information Act?
Not really. I mean, everything. In terms of what? People making too many...
Either mischievous...
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's part of it. You know, you have to be adult and kind of live with that. I don't hear too many people complaining about it, but today I was listening to the Minister for Enterprise, Pat O'Keefe, being interviewed on the radio, and this had to do with, I think, the €2 billion that the banks are supposed to...
3 billion per annum.
To give to small and medium. And obviously, Minister O'Keefe had said last week that, oh no, it wasn't him, it was him, and it was also Frank Daly, who's the chairman of NAMA, and was saying that the banks had not been forthcoming with information. Am I correct in that? Or the information hadn't been...
The information they got wasn't accurate, I think, because it didn't turn out to be as accurate as they thought it was going to be.
So anyway, Minister O'Keefe was asked on 2 occasions by the interviewer today, do you trust the banks? And he didn't answer. He couldn't answer. And he said it's not a question of trusting them. He talked about some particular individual that is now in charge of...
This is the Credit Review Office, I suspect.
That's right.
And John Trethowan, who actually said that he thought the banks were lending and any viable business that looked for...
but I thought... I mean, it's extraordinary, everything that has happened and the situation we find ourselves in, and the need for us to have trust that what is being put in place now is going to work. And crucial and critical to this are the banks. And we have a minister telling us, in effect, that he doesn't trust them.
Not a very nice place to be.
No, and I think there is a case, therefore, I think that really underlines the case for a greater enablement of the public to see what's going on. I mean, I can understand, pragmatically why they don't want FOI. They don't want to leave anything to chance. They don't want anything to get out that might, disturb things, if they could be any more disturbed. And also, I suppose, they want to put the energies into sorting things out rather than fiddling around with FOI requests. But I think there is a greater public interest there.
So as Information Commissioner, then, would you favour those kind of bodies being FOI-able?
Yeah, I mean, the way it works in the UK is that, to the best of my knowledge, every public body is in.
Yes.
Whereas here, there are certain bodies that are in and certain bodies that are out. And the Gardaí are still out, obviously. And I think it would be better, let everything in and then assess everything on a case-by-case basis in line with the exemptions, in line with the public interest and the various harms that may be done by the release of certain information.
Okay, I'm going to invite the audience to ask you a few questions, but let me ask you this one. As you face into this second term, what are the things that you expect people to be most bothered about, given the whole change in the economic environment, given the shift in the emphasis of where government is focused and so on?
Well, obviously, their jobs and their families and, their children and what their children are going to do after school or after college. I think that's a huge, huge issue. I'm not sure whether... and I know that I'm conscious that the Taoiseach this morning said we don't want to talk down the economy and we need to be positive and absolutely, because confidence is such a big thing. But I still think that people are very uncertain about where all of this is going. I mean, certainly as Ombudsman, we're getting a great deal more. It's funny, when I became Ombudsman, most of the complaints, or a lot of the complaints, or the big increase in complaints around planning, now it's around social benefits and so on and so forth. I mean, I saw today a headline this evening in one of the news sites that there's been a 50% increase in people going to the St. Vincent de Paul.
Yeah.
Obviously.
So the let's call it the
very basic stuff.
The community conversation has shifted from being obsessed with property to being surviving.
To surviving, yeah. I mean, I think health obviously is going to be a big issue as well, because with cutbacks there. And, you know, my remit in relation to health has expanded, and certainly over the next 3 years I intend to focus particularly on not particularly, but give a special emphasis to health, so that people are aware that my office is there to deal with health complaints
And
as
of
well
course,
as everything else.
given your comments earlier about the private-public issue around health, we've a former private sector business person, a professional manager, shall we say, coming in to run the HSE now when Professor Drum steps down, I think, next month.
Yeah, and we can only wish him luck. I mean, I think, you know, Professor Drum came into a new organisation, and with perhaps a lot of the old culture still there. I mean, I suppose at least the new individual can say he wasn't.
He didn't know what he was walking into.
He didn't know what he was walking into, and I mean, we can just really wish him luck. But there has to be a national conversation. That seems very wishy-washy, but there has to be a conversation about what our public and cultural values are around health and the health system that we want.
Okay, well, maybe on that note, I might open up the conversation to the floor.